There is a difference between illustrations that are just there to carry the text and the models that actually are more important than the text because you learn from the model and the text explains the model. So that's two different things. I start with the structure of the book. So what kind of content do we want to put in there?
I had a chance to talk to Esther Gons, who is the co-author of 2 award-winning books, also the translator of one of my books. She did the Dutch version of the Bomb Test. And she is a designer and does a design-led style of writing, where they begin with the illustration, they begin with the visual representation of what they want to say, and then the words come later. This is obviously a very different workflow, a very different process for building a book. Esther is a master at it. This is sort of just a 10-minute how-to about how she thinks about visual first book design.
How are you? It's been a long time.
Actually, we just won another gold medal with our second book. So really proud of that.
Congratulations.
So innovation accounting. In 2019, we won it with the corporate startup.
There's something to your process then, right? It's clearly working.
Yeah, once you're lucky, twice you're good, right? So
I was hoping that you would share your process for doing the design-led and heavily illustrated nonfiction books. Does it start with the words? Does it start with the diagram? Like, what's the back and forth? How are you doing feedback? It feels to me whenever I make an image, everything moves so much slower because now the text and the image are sort of locked together and I find it hard to iterate, hard to improve.
So for me, there's two types of drawings. There's the structure of the book. That is really important because that structure gives you a way to find things again. So are there elements that are the same in every chapter? What kind of content are we going to offer? Is there a pattern that we can discern, and how do I want to template that? So that's the one thing that's really important. And then there is a difference between illustrations that are just there to carry the text and the models that actually are more important than the text because you learn from the model and the text explains the model. So that's two different things. I start with the structure of the book. So what kind of content do we want to put in there?
Is this before you even write the thing? This is kind of pre-manuscript? You're already thinking about this?
Yeah, so we have a Trello board. What do we want to be in there? What kind of content is important? How do we want to offer that content? And what kind of content needs to be in there? So then it's a little bit more in terms of detail and writing. I'm more into research and practical experience that I want to put out there. And then we think about, okay, so what kind of content do we have? How do we structure it? And so then we have these layers of information. And then we think about what does that mean in terms of outline? And then I just go back and forth and I say, no, we can't do it like this because this is a wrong build-up and it doesn't make sense. So we do a sort of an outline. And then based on the outline, we start to fill out what kind of content makes sense to put in there, right? Do we want case studies? Do we want interviews? Do we want just practical knowledge? Do I see a pattern? If I see a pattern, I start moving content into boxes, and these boxes then should have a different design. So this is where I start. We discuss outline, and that's the kind of content that gets in there so that I can see a pattern. And from there, decide how we structure. And I make a note in Trello as well as I draw. Okay, that means every chapter has theory, practical knowledge, an interview, and some exercises, right? So these are 4 different things that need to have a different design structure within the book. That's level 1. If we are sort of agreeing on how that should work, then we start to write outlines and content based on that pattern, right? And I can start designing the structure outline for my book. Then the second layer that comes later on, if we have done more research, actually written stuff, we start thinking about models. So if there's things that we need to explain that are really important, like the models that we have in our book with the layers and how information abstracts from one level in another. I draw quick sketches and then we can write the content based on these models.
For the models or the crucial illustrations, you start with the illustration and then the text is supporting the illustration rather than the other way around.
The actual illustrations, those are simple. I do those when the book is finished. I just start drawing stuff that makes sense to have some sort of support, but that's the last thing I do.
Because those don't change the flow or change the education design. They're just embellishment, whereas the structural ones are core.
Exactly. So the structural ones are the most important ones. They need to be in there. And the structure as a whole needs to be part of the book. That's the beginning, because you need to be able to find things. My philosophy is I need at least one illustration on each page to make it more readable. That depends on the size of the book, the end design, if I pull it all together. Sometimes I throw them out because there's not enough room. Sometimes I make them smaller. So these are just the last resort.
That's super useful. It makes a ton of sense. So for example, I've been making some video courses recently, and I find it's like easy to write and it's easy to make videos. But once I start combining them, it's like to make a change to the text, I need to change the video. When I change the video, I need to change the text around it. And I'd imagine the same is true with these crucial knowledge-bearing illustrations. How does the iteration and the improvement process work when you're needing to change both?
So for the illustrations, that's just the end result. But that's easy, right? So I do them after the text is written. So the models that are really important, I sketch them out as a sketch. So that's where we start the writing from. Then if something changes in the writing, I can iterate on the model.
Even reviewing these, are you pasting the illustrations into a Google Doc? Like, are they separate cards? Like, what's your actual process for just seeing these things together?
We have a chapter, but that also means that sometimes I'm throwing chapters around. So I have it in my head because I'm that holistic. So for me, it's quite easy, and I sketch a lot on how I see this. So we work together in Google and have chapters that I put the drawings in, the sketches in, and we work together on the text, and then something changes and I redo the sketch and put it in again. So we work together like that. But on a structural level, like the structure that we begin with, sometimes that need to change halfway through as well because the content starts different. And then I need to change that around, but that's not as easy to do in the Google Doc chapters. I also always start design an InDesign doc. So I start designing the book to see if what I have in my head makes sense on the paper, to see if the structure works, if people could find it, if the model works.
It sounds like that's almost an early prototype for you, where you just want to see what it looks like as a full page spread, and then you don't mind so much if you have to throw it away.
No, sometimes I throw it away. It's what we send the backers if they do the pre-read. And then I can also show, if we want to change things around, what that would mean if you put it on paper. And I design it in spreads. And that's a lot of work, but it's the only thing that I can show what is in my head to other people.
When you're doing those spreads, do you link it together where changes in the Google Doc automatically appear? Or is it just a case where that's not worth the fuss and you're just pasting in text manually whenever you need to?
I'm pasting it manually. We have the agreement that the Google Doc is the source of truth, right? So that it should be the main text, because the editor works in the Google Docs. Sometimes it doesn't matter if the text in the InDesign publication is a little bit different, because I just want to show if it works, but the end text is always the Google Doc. And it's also a text, you can copy paste text pretty easily within InDesign.
You go like, oh, this is nice text, but it's like a bit too long. You know, we need to remove 2 paragraphs to fit it in this page spread. So it sounds almost like it starts with the learning goals, which gets manifested as an illustration. Then there's prose, then it gets page spreaded, but then that creates editing constraints that are going to change the prose and the text. Is that right?
Yeah, because there's also not only spread constraints, but also maximum number of page constraints, right? In a book that is our size, the oblong size that are most of these, like Alexander Osterwalder's book are all these kind of sizes, you have a page constraint somewhere between 200 and 300 pages. Everything over 300 pages is going to be too much. And especially if a lot of these books is telling the same thing over and over, and then you just drop off. If it's not telling things over and over, but it's really condensed like our books, then it's too much if it's more than that. So the drop-off is around 300 pages. And you need to have a lot of white space. People forget that. And you need things like word search and all kinds of acknowledgement. So there's less pages than you think there will be. So you need to really think what is necessary or not. So we just write what we want to write in terms of what we decided on structure first. So that's why it's so important to determine on outline and structure. What do you want and what kind of things it need to look like? And then you just start scratching and make it more concise and more condensed. So for instance, that meant that we had to pull out a complete chapter on ethics that we wanted to be in there, because it's so important then when you innovate that you ask the question, do we want to expose the world to this? Does that make sense in terms of people, right?
Yeah, the Jurassic Park question. We can, but should we?
Yeah, but should we, right? For us, it was really important, but then it was just too much. And we asked ourselves the question, if this is business intelligence, is that something that we need to tell people, or is it something that we can blog about and then leave out, right? So these are decisions that you then have to make. But we also made them through the early backers that did pre-reading. So what was too much for them? What needed to be more concise? Can we replace some of the text with models that make more sense instead of explaining it?
With a visual book, were you doing your beta reading using the page spreads, or were you doing it
Yeah.
with a Google
No,
Doc?
no, the page spreads. Some of the chapters we did Google Doc, but that was some friends that were experts on that specific chapter, just the text. But for all of the backers, they got the doc and the page spreads. I made a Google form with the visual pages. And then if they had a comment, they should comment it with the visual pages.
And the feedback was helpful?
You always get different feedback, right? So there's people that go like, oh, you made a spelling mistake. And then there's people that go like, oh, but I didn't understand this bit. What did you actually mean by that? And that's good feedback, because when you're writing about something that is so part of your expertise, you forget that you are that 1% that knows so much about it. But you need to explain it to people that are 10 steps behind you, right? So you need people that are somewhere in between to tell you, that's nice, but I didn't get it. What do you mean? So that's very helpful.
This has been a gold mine for me, and I can't wait to share it with the authors community. Thank you so much for the time.